Thank you, Carolyn.
Thank
Well,
you.
it's lovely to be here, and it's lovely to be invited to be part of this dialogue. And it's fantastic to see this book from Erik come out. I'm really excited. I haven't read it, especially haven't read it, just so that I can actually find out about it, like the rest of us, from Erik, and find out a bit about the book and what it says. Erik, I mean, maybe you could start off by just telling us why you wrote it. What drove you to write this?
Oh, maybe your book, Mick. You wrote a very similar book, which looks like this. Really nice cover as well. It looks like a file, like an archive.
Like a very messy file.
A messy archive, but it contains, not in a very messy way, it contains all the results found to date when you published it in quantitative research in psychotherapy and counseling. And I wanted to do something similar for the coaching field, the workplace and executive coaching field. And I'm delighted to celebrate the launch with you, because you're a kindred, a similar author.
Yeah.
At least with that book.
Why do you think the field needed a book summarizing that research?
Yeah, well, I have seen an explosion in research in coaching over the last 5 years. So this was always, Tony Grant in Sydney has made these famous graphs of how many articles were published per year, and they went exponentially up anyway. But I can see over the last couple of years a lot of PhD projects coming to fruition in executive coaching around the world. So there is a lot to report on, I believe, and only now is you could also argue that the research base is only just big enough to have a, you know, to build conclusions on. Yeah.
How much do you think people in executive coaching have been using the research to date?
Well, good question. Yeah, there's a lot of executive coaches here today, so I should be careful about what I say. But there is a bit of a gap between research, I would say, research and practice. So we love being present with our clients and really helping them. But only very few of us enjoy reading highly statistical, nearly mathematical articles that give the results of a quantitative experiment, which is very often, I have to say, just like those PhDs, it's not an experiment in the world of coaching. Very often it's often done by students, student coaches and student coachees. So there is a bit of a gap between research and practice, but fortunately there are also very realistic studies, which I really liked, and I try to bring out a bit more in the book as well.
I mean, I guess, if I was an executive coach, and just say my background's in psychotherapy and, my knowledge of it is limited. But if I was an executive coach, I might think, well, look, I've had my training, I'm working with clients, and I have a sense for myself of what works and doesn't work. Why do I need to know about research? What's research going to tell me, or how's it going to help me?
Yeah, well, there's lots of things that might help you. Coaches are often very, very preoccupied with their own contribution to a conversation. Their interventions and which interventions and when, etc. And you can see from some of the research that is actually not so very important. That different interventions don't always give you different results. And then maybe the book can be used also towards the clients, or the commissioners even of coaching in large organizations, because they can see that it's not all kind of soft, woolen socks, hippie or whatever they think about coaching, kind of a contribution which has no content or no bones to it, because it's just merely just sitting down and listening. And they might see that they can expect results, at least statistically, from the book.
So do you think that executive coaches should be driven by the research, informed by the research? Do you think they should kind of have it in the back of their minds? How should they use it before we get into what the research actually says?
Yeah, I think they can be inspired by the research. So it can give them a richness. I really believe in associations in this field. So the client having a freedom of association, but also the coach associating freely on whatever is brought to the session. So as part of their associations, they might link with a research outcome. and that could enrich their practice a little bit, and it might give them some more confidence as well to read that some studies are successful and some coaches are successful.
So you're not saying that they should just look at the research and say, well, I should do this, this, and this, but you're saying that they should use it as maybe one source of information and guidance and association.
Yes.
About how to practice with a particular client.
Right. And maybe also for humility in some cases, because I found a very interesting article, very rigorously researched article from India, or at least the research took place in India, where the youngest coaches were the most impactful. Wow. And the ones most recently trained and with the least years of experience as a coach, they were the most impactful. So for us who've been around, that helps us maybe to be humble and to be as much as we can open to experience and fresh.
Yeah, I know when I did my book on psychotherapy and counseling, one of the things I talked a bit about was the role of research in challenging us, and that that we always have expectations and assumptions and biases, and the research can help us think, actually, is that right? Or maybe, I need, as you say, something about openness.
Yeah.
So Erik, tell us, and we'll get into the research, and I'm sure that's the most interesting bit about what the research says. But before we do that, can you give us a sense of how much research there is? What's the field of research like? What are we looking at? What are we talking about?
Yeah, I have to admit, and people know this who are on this call, I'm a bit of a nerd. So I never shed my physics background altogether, and I've been counting. I was counting the articles again and again and again. So I'm pretty sure now that we have 35 articles which have a randomized control trial in them. And we have another 125 which are independent quantitative studies in coaching, serious studies. So we've got 160 studies in the book, which are really serious studies, because there've been hundreds more, or maybe 100 more, which only have pre and post measurements. And we all know, statisticians know that you can't really discover much through only pre and post measurements without a control group, right. Especially if it's mostly self-scored and etc. So I left some of those more hobby type articles. I had to leave them out of the book, so as to make it not too unwieldy. But 160 serious ones.
160 serious ones. Maybe just let people know an RCT. Do you want to just explain what that is?
I
have.
Erik is frozen.
Erik is frozen.
Coached, but it's
Erik is
same.
back.
Sorry, Erik, we missed that. Do you want to say that bit again?
Oh, sorry.
You froze for a moment. What? So just explain what an RCT is.
So it's a randomized controlled trial. So you have two groups going in parallel through the trial, ideally, where they are both drawn from the same sample. So they are interchangeable. They're the same managers, let's say from the same company of the same level, but randomly they're put in these two groups, ideally of equal size, and they go through the whole experiment and they do the same questionnaires at various stages, but only one of these groups gets coaching. So it's very similar to what we're all learning about vaccines and, control trials, randomized control trials in vaccines. And
what you're saying is it means that you can understand the effects of the coaching specifically, rather than just looking at from the beginning to the end, because there might be other changes over time that make it difficult to disentangle what's going on there.
Yes, then anything you find can be attributed to the coaching. And there's even one or two studies usually done by doctors. They're very good at this. There's one study done in the medical field where the coachees were junior doctors. And what they did, they only added 3 more coaching sessions. So both groups were actually coached. So they all received some coaching, but the intervention group received 3 more sessions. Right. So then really everything is the same. Except for those 3 sessions. So you can calculate the added value if there is a difference in outcomes between a group that has 3 sessions and a group that has everything the same, and misses those 3 sessions of coaching.
Yeah, that's fantastic to have that research, and it's great that you brought it together. How many of the studies were specifically about executive coaching, or was it?
Good question. Yeah. Of course, realistic studies are difficult to get. I think out of the 35, there were 7 or 8 with managers or executives in both groups.
And what were the other ones?
Well, I would say half of them were with students, that they were rewarded with credit points for their studies or a bit of money. And then the students were coachees, and maybe a 2-year older student of 23 or 24 from psychology would be the coach. So not very realistic in terms of our field. That's half of them. The other half took place, as I said, in hospitals. Now, the one that I just mentioned is with doctors in training. So that's pretty workplace oriented coaching. So that's fine. But there were other studies which were done with patients. And then it's called health coaching. And in fact, I summarized this literature in the book because it's very, very rigorous, and I think it's important. And it has 100 randomized control trials by now, so it's really substantial. But I don't mix it with the results from workplace coaching. I try to keep that separate because it's patients with a condition who get a few calls on the phone, and those calls are mainly telling them, please, could you take your medicine? You know, it's almost running up to 6 o'clock in the evening. You have to take your medicine. It makes a difference. So, you know, only in America, we would call that coaching. You know, that's very instructional. that's very top down, isn't it? That kind of call. But it's well researched. So I wanted to put it in the book.
Okay, brilliant. So let's get into some of the findings. So I guess the key question that we all want to know is, overall, does executive coaching work?
Yeah, well, the answer is still positive, and for the first time, I think we can have a really well-argued answer, because immediately after the book, it's here, by the way, sorry you don't have it still, but immediately after the book, we made a so-called meta-analysis, which is a statistical way of summarizing those randomized controlled trials, and out of that came an effect size, significantly different from 0. It was 0.6, and that means quite a considerable effect. For fun, you could think about boys of the age of 14 and 18. How different in length are they? Or actually even between 13 and 18, you can see the difference in length between 2 boys of those 2 age groups. And well, that's exactly the significance of this effect size. So it's quite a visible effect. It should be visible to others around the coachee. And it's 0.6. And then if you want to be really technical about it, if you do a meta-analysis nowadays, you do a good one, you have a prediction interval. So you have an interval that you expect the effect sizes to be in, and that shouldn't touch 0 if you want a real good argument. And ours just straddles the 0, but 99% of our prediction interval is above 0, which is a very good result. And in fact, that one is better than in psychotherapy, because I think because the psychotherapy world is larger and more diverse, you get prediction intervals which actually include the 0 still, if you look at the newest articles. So I'm proud of that.
Yeah, well, in terms of the kind of comparative magnitude, I think in psychotherapy and counseling, it's about 0.45.
No, it's higher. If you look at if you look at just the effectiveness of outcome, it's higher than coaching. So I would argue it's between 0.7 and 0.8. I should look it up in your book, actually, but we don't have the time.
I think, Erik, I think my book's a bit outdated. I think it's coming down. I think
it is coming down. That's true, but I thought it was coming down to about 0.7. But now we get a polemic here in the middle of our webinar.
Well, I'll have to. I'm about to start reworking my book, so I'll let you know in a year's time. But I mean, an effect size of 0.6. I mean, that's kind of moderate to large, isn't it? I mean, that's impressive.
Yeah, I think it's impressive. Yeah.
And it shows that executive coaching makes a real difference to what are the outcomes, Erik?
Yeah, I mean, maybe not executive coaching because it's only a minority of those studies, but it shows that coaching in the wider sense makes a difference. And then, yes, what are the outcomes? That's another problem. A lot of the scales are self-scored. So it makes a significant difference between those two groups in terms of how they self-assess for example, what is used very often, which I really like, is the attainment of goals. So you ask the coachees and the non-coachees to score their attainment of their own goals. And in fact, the coachees get much further along towards their goals. They also get more resilient, they get, but these are self-scored parameters. And I was also happy to find in some of those RCTs, about 10 of them, objective scores. And those are, of course, much better. For example, the one with the doctors that I mentioned, I think they were surgeons, and their skills in surgery were demonstrably better when they had the coaching. So that is really interesting if you can measure in an objective way. And of course, in our profession, you can measure in a somewhat intersubjective or objective way by doing a 360 before and after the randomized control trial, a 360 feedback instrument. And that's been done. And that also shows those differences. So really good.
And in these studies, what kind of level of intervention are we talking about? I know it obviously varies, but can you give us a kind of average idea of how much input they're getting?
Yeah, I think it's usually 5 or 6 sessions, what they're getting. One really surprising thing, maybe you've seen that as well, because it also occurs in psychotherapy. We are finding increasingly that the effect size is the same across a large number of sessions. So whether you give somebody 4 sessions or 20, they broadly achieve the same effect size, which is very counterintuitive. Because you would think you increase the dose by 5 times more in 20 sessions, you would expect a much higher effect size. Yeah. But it seems to be the case that the patient or the client spreads out their effect up on the amount of sessions that they get.
Yeah, you get the same thing in the psychotherapy research, and they talk about a kind of good enough outcome. One of the reasons in therapy is because people drop out or finish if they've got to where they want to be. So somebody who has 4 sessions finishes after 4 because they got where they want to be, and whereas somebody 20. But what I wanted to ask you, Erik, is is there any evidence on longer term effects? I mean, is it mainly at the end of the coaching, or what about after that?
No, there are studies. One study is our own study where we measure again 3 months later, and there are several more who do that, even within the randomized control trials, and that's good practice as well. If they can. It's a lot more work and discipline from the researchers and from the subjects in the research, but that's been done. And what we see is a slight leveling off. But really, if you start here on average, you end here on average, then the leveling off is only a little bit. So it's quite robust.
And again, very similar to psychotherapy, where that's what you tend to see there. Is there any studies about cost effectiveness?
That's a very good question. The final chapter in the book is about negative side effects or adverse effects, because there have been some studies into that, not very many, but I summarize those as well, whether there are negative side effects. And in fact, any coach, it turns out in that research, any coach or any client can come up with one from their most recent work. So it's amazing how many negative side effects people can at least, report. But I turn it around in that last chapter. I say that whenever you don't find an effect, which happens in many studies, many of these 160 studies don't find an effect, then you have a negative side effect because of the costliness, the cost price of coaching. So because you lose money and you don't get anything for it. It is a very interesting one to ask about cost. And of course, there are a few studies in managerial coaching which are really fascinating, where they earn back the investment in coaching in a real way. Because, for example, in phone centers, or there's 2 examples. One is in phone centers where people are on helplines. The other one is in restaurants where they have mystery guests, and they get the waiters get coached, or the people who are taking the calls in the helplines get coached by their managers. And you can see that if you invest in coaching by giving the managers some training, which you pay for, and you take away time from the managers to actually coach their helpline service providers, then the call times reduce. So the company makes a better margin. and they can do, instead of 1,000 calls a day, is incredible numbers. It must be an awful job, but anyway, they do 1,000 calls a day, and then after coaching they can do 1,050 calls a day, and that difference easily pays for the coaching. Huh?
No, I was just saying, presumably that's not one person.
It is one. I believe it's
one person.
Yes, it's shocking. Yeah, those are very simple call lines where people have very simple questions.
Wow.
And as soon as they put the phone down, on their screen automatically comes the next call. It's really horrendous work.
It does make you wonder if that's a good outcome or a bad outcome.
Yes, Mike, that's another very sensitive area for another day. But it's interesting that, giving them coaching, which means taking them out of those helplines during the day, they get some conversations with their managers, that makes them fresher for taking more calls, and also better product, better help, better service
Erik,
quality.
You mentioned something about negative outcomes. Just go back to that for a minute. So what kind of negative, you talked about the positive, it sounds like overall the outcomes are positive, but what kind of negative outcomes, what kind of magnitude or percentage or what do we know about negative outcomes of executive coaching?
Well, out of the 160 articles, there are about 100 who actually try to measure impact of coaching. The others try to look at differences between different interventions and so on. So you have about 100 articles that try to show that coaching is effective, and only 90 of those can do that. So there's 10 articles that show that actually the control group is doing better than the intervention group and things like that. Very weird outcomes. There are 10 articles who have that, and I'm very grateful to those authors that they still published, because there is the famous file drawer problem. There's the problem that if you don't find interesting outcomes, that you don't want to publish anymore, and you don't think your own model has been confirmed. And so if you are really serious about this and a nerd like myself, you have to multiply that number of 10 by 5, because we know in social science that about 4 out of 5 null hypotheses or negative outcomes are not being published. So then the reality looks more like we have 90 articles showing that coaching is effective, but we have 10 articles, which means 50 studies that shows that coaching is not effective.
Do you mean not effective or negative effects?
Yeah, both. They have both. Those 10 articles that we have, I think, again, the majority shows that there's null effect. There's no difference between the two groups. And there's 3 or 4, 2 or 3 or so, not very many, that show a better effect for the control group than the intervention group.
Was there anything kind of consistent about those studies? Nothing at this point.
Or maybe I should have thought about that more, but there's nothing in the book about what makes them similar. No.
But I absolutely agree with you. It's so important to publish that, because that's how we learn, isn't it? When you do these things, and it's hard, but that's where we learn. So Erik, what I wanted to go on and ask you about is then, so it's fantastic to hear about the kind of overall effectiveness, effect size 0.6, something, executive coaches can be really proud of. So about the ingredients, let's talk about that. So what is it that you've learned makes executive coaching, or coaching more generally, what is it that makes it effective? Is it the model? Is it the person of the coach? Is it the client? Is it something to do with the relationship? Let's go through those.
Yeah, many of those actually.
Let's start with the person.
Here's the answer.
Okay, so let's start with the person of the coach. Does that make a difference? Do we know anything about that?
We know something about that. We need more work, of course, but we know that if the coach is credible, that makes a huge difference. So there have been studies where somebody on an MBA in a business school gets either a peer coach or some other manager in a company similar to them as a coach, as an external coach to them, or they get a faculty member who was never trained to be a coach, but who happens to be a faculty member in that business school as a coach, and it's an incredible difference in impact. So they clearly want to work with a faculty member then who seems more credible or seems more professional, whatever it is. And the effectiveness, and that's a very good article as well, the effectiveness of the faculty member is really significantly larger than that of the peer coach. In fact, the peer coach is no more effective than self-coaching with a little manual. So that's amazing. And there's more research like that. When credibility was measured and correlated with outcome, you always see that it correlates very strongly.
So
If
when
the
you
coach
say
is credible, has a couple of titles in front of their name, so it's such as you, some who has a reputation, works maybe for a known university, such as you, you would do really well on some of those studies. And that's, I mean, it's unfortunate. And I know that in counseling, it's even worse. I mean, in counseling, there's been more studies. They also looked at physical attractiveness and things like that. And it also shows a big difference, which, nothing to do with the quality of coaching, but it does matter that, it gives the client more trust somehow, and maybe more openness and confidence that it will work.
That's really interesting. So credibility is a big one. What else is there? Other what about things like age, gender? Do other factors seem to make much difference?
There seems to be, I do note in the book that we need to look into a slight gender difference, where women coaches might be more impactful than men coaches. And I would welcome that. I mean, I see this as a very female profession. People who know me better know that one of my ideals in the field is the goddess Athena from Greece, the war goddess of defense, and she is a female. So and not for no reason. And also in our society, of course, culturally, to listen somewhat to someone, to care for someone, to support someone, those are all very gendered contributions.
Is there any, I mean, in therapy, we have a kind of notion of the super shrink. Is there any notion of what the super coach would look like? Is it Athena then? Is that supported by the evidence?
I like your question, and I know about that research, but it's not been done in coaching. So we've got 100 serious coaches on the line today, so maybe one of them can investigate the super shrink in coaching. It's a good one.
What they would look like. Yeah, but certainly, I mean, in therapy again, female therapists do slightly better. And there's a kind of style which is probably very similar to coaching, which is slightly kind of caring is a big one that comes into it, kind of taking someone in your arms and saying, right, let's make this happen, kind of quite involved style. I think that in therapy we know seems to be the qualities of our super shrink. So it'd be interesting to see if that's also there in your coaching. What about, is there any work on ethnicity and ethnic matching? Because that's another one in our field. But if a client's working who's black, works with someone who's black therapist, they tend to prefer it a bit and tend to do a bit better.
Yes, there is an article or a study by Lisa Boyce and a few others in the American military, which happens to be quite diverse, certainly geographically, but also in terms of class and definitely also race. So she's looked at those variables there, and she actually finds no difference as far as I remember. So there's not much difference, but you do see in other pieces of research that so similar gender matching seems to be so men working with men and women with women might be also a factor. But what is it? Of course, in our profession, mostly people choose their coach, so it's mostly their own choice to choose a woman or a man, and that is, I think, the bigger deal, that you can choose yourself than what gender your coach is.
Well, it'll be interesting to come back to preferences in a minute, but the next thing I wanted to ask you is about modality. I mean, certainly in therapy, we have a lot of different approaches, and I don't know so much about in coaching, but does that make a difference? Are there some forms of coaching that are more effective than others?
Yeah, this is a very highly, as you know, also in psychotherapy, but it's highly politicized, this, highly disputed. So partly because of the training that people had in the past, so they become very attached and devoted to it, but partly also through the kind of newer, transformational schools of psychology, and in particular positivist psychology has been very fervent in trying to say solution-focused coaching is better than other approaches. And so there are many articles that argue that, but you can read them in
what does
different
the
ways.
evidence tell us, Erik?
Well, I think the evidence, I mean, I try to present this very honestly and objectively in the book, but I think they mostly show that it's good for a coach to be friendly. It's good for a coach to be confident. It doesn't really show that those precise interventions in those schools, so the miracle question or the scaling or anything like that, or the particular questions that they ask, which are more future oriented, that they have a lot of evidence behind them. And I know of many other articles also that compare different modalities directly, and they don't show much difference in coaching, but it's much less than in psychotherapy what's been done. And there are a few, there's a guy called Ray Hui. He now works in Japan, but I think his background is from Hong Kong. And he's done some really good studies where he shows that, more basic directive coaching can help with more basic tasks, and more subtle non-directive coaching can help with new tasks. And I would recommend to everyone to read some of his articles. They're very convincing. So he argues that, they all have some value, but they might orient themselves to slightly different outcomes, these different modalities.
Okay. So when you say basic tasks, when you say basic tasks,
yes, it's very basic in his case. It's again done with students, I think, or also random adults from adverts. And what he does, the tasks are in PowerPoint or Excel. So you have to make an Excel file, and you get some coaching on that. And if you had coaching on, basic instructional, nearly instructional, it's called guidance coaching. You get guidance on your Excel, then you become really good at Excel. But if you then suddenly get a task on PowerPoint, then you kind of you tumble and you fall over and you get stuck. Whereas if you had the other type of coaching, which he calls facilitates, where you have more questions and answers and listening, and then you might not get as far in Excel, but you're better prepared for PowerPoint if you suddenly get a PowerPoint task. And that's one of the ways he argues that different kinds of coaching can give you different results.
Yeah, that's fascinating.
Yeah.
And a really interesting area for further research. You talked about friendliness. So does the relationship, what's the kind of, in the therapy field, the best predictor of outcomes, apart from the client we'll come on to, is the relationship. Is it similar in coaching?
Yes, absolutely. And we've done some of that research in Ashridge. So we find that as well, but we're finding something very interesting, which has also been found in recent years in psychotherapy, which is that the relationship doesn't actually determine or correlate with the outcome per session. It only correlates with a sort of an overall outcome. So it doesn't seem to be important from session to session. So I think there's a lot more work that we need to do into the coaching relationship, because saying it's a good predictor, the best predictor overall, might tell us more about clients than about actual coaching conversations. So it's a whole chapter in the book. The whole chapter is devoted to the relationship because of this.
Fantastic. Do you have based on your kind of studying of the research, do you have a sense of what are the most important relational qualities? You said friendliness. Is that, certainly that comes out in the therapy research. Is there other things?
Yeah, no, not so much, because there hasn't been so much research into the coach, but confidence as well. And sometimes in the German research that has been done, it's called dominant friendly coaches. They seem to be very, very effective. But I don't think that's a modality. I think it's just a way of being with a little bit of confidence. Similarly, in psychotherapy, you see that the allegiance of a therapist is very important, that they believe in their own ideology. Well, that seems to be the same in coaching.
Yeah. Well, it's similar in therapy, really. They're kind of slightly dominant without being overpowering, but kind of confident is a nice word of being confident and friendly, and that kind of quadrant.
Yes. Yeah.
It does seem to be the qualities of that super string that I was talking about earlier. We're just coming up to the end of our dialogue together, but the last thing I wanted to ask you about is the client, because when I did my book, that's the thing that I really discovered, is that so much of the outcomes at the end of the day is actually more about the client than about the facilitator, the therapist. And I just wondered does that come through in your research as well?
Definitely, yeah. You know how to ask all the right questions, Mick, because we asked the right person for doing this interview. But you're totally right about that. And the way I phrased it in the book at one point is that it's actually problematic if I'm a little bit left wing in my voting. So I vote for the Green Party normally and have done for the past decades. And I find the finding on clients very elitist, and I don't like it. So what we see in coaching, and there's lots of papers on this, is that a client who is already resilient, so scores high on a resilience, on a very well validated resilience questionnaire, has a better outcome at the end of coaching. A client who already has well-being under their belt, they have more than average well-being, they also project into a better outcome. And thirdly, just to give one more example, optimism, I could say, and hope, but also social support. So a client with a good social support network gets more out of coaching. And well, sometimes I think, we work with the elite in organizations, with the people who can afford us, let's say at the top. And we also have the most impact on people who don't actually need it that much. So I think that's a really tragic thing about our profession. It is an impactful profession, but it seems to be geared towards a luxury, a commodity kind of intervention. And I'm at the moment I'm doing research in AI coaching, so automated coaching. I think we need to think about ways to make this helpful intervention more available to other clients as well.
Again, and it's amazing the similarities with the therapy research, where we say the rich get richer, and it's a real problem.
Yes. That's the thing.
As a therapist, you're working with people with maybe borderline personality, difficult attachments, and they're the ones who often struggle most to get something out of therapy.
They drop out as well much more, don't they? Yeah.
So the very last question, Erik, it's been fascinating talking to you, but as a practitioner, as a coaching practitioner, having immersed yourself in all this research and read it and gone through this amazing body of work, what have you taken away from it as a practitioner? And in what ways has it affected your practice, and that other people might also affect their practice? What do you think in terms of practice? What's changed?
I just felt it as very supportive, what I found. So by and large, I was fascinated with even the help that managers can do. So maybe I should mention that I'm more of a believer in managerial coaching than I used to be. So and we're also slowly at Ashridge doing a bit more to help leaders to coach their teams better or differently. You can see from some of the articles that the effectiveness of managerial coaching is also very high. So that's worth exploring more. In fact, in the meta-analysis, we've taken the 4 articles, the 4 RCTs, which have managerial coaching. We've taken them out of some of the analysis because the effectiveness was a lot higher. And of course, the manager has a lot more time than just coaching with their direct report. So we felt we had to put them aside to start the real detailed analysis. Mm-hmm. But that means that managerial coaching is working. That's maybe the biggest thing.
So it sounds like in terms of your own practice and in terms of practice, what you're taking most out from it is kind of confidence. Yeah. And a kind of more of a belief in what you do, which, as you say, in terms of the effectiveness, that's probably going to enhance your effectiveness, isn't it? Because
I believe in it more.
Confidence and you believe in it, so it's a win-win.
That's how the mind works. Yeah,
Erik, it's been brilliant.
We need to go to the Q&A.
We need to go to the Q&A.